I think it is time to take a look at New Stanton. Uh, if you remember, when we looked at Grapeville, it was one of those places that started out one place and ended up somewhere else. Well, when we look at New Stanton, we have the same situation. I don't know why or how it happens. Well, I do know how. But it did happen that New Stanton, like Grapeville, started out one place and then ended up somewhere else. What we have to say is that the two places for New Stanton are only about a mile apart. What used to be New Stanton is now Old Stanton and almost totally forgotten about. And New Stanton is now somewhere else. The big issues for both of these places were transportation corridors. If you know anything about New Stanton, you know it is a big transportation hub. And in the north, the original New Stanton, which is now Old Stanton, it was on what was called the Old Glade Road, or the Old Clay Road sometimes. It was the road from Somerset going to Pittsburgh. And a guy named Benjamin Snyder laid out the town of New Stanton, which is now Old Stanton, but he laid out then New Stanton in the early 1800s. Now, about a mile south of that was another place, the place that eventually became New Stanton. And the major factor there was a transportation route in a sense, the creek, the Big Sewickley, and eventually in the 1870s it was the railroad, the Southwest Branch. But before the Southwest Branch came along, there was a mill down there. Mills are often big issues when it comes to settlements. Many settlements have been founded around old mills. And the mill that was founded down there was called Stanton Mill. So we're getting some idea of the origins of New Stanton. The guy who settled there and who had the patent for the property was a fellow named Weber, or Weaver. Actually, he was a German immigrant, and his name Weber in German translates in English to weaver. So we're going to get a look at all these things as we look at pictures. And we're going to cut down this part of it and move to the next part where we see pictures. This is an overall view given to us by Google Earth. Up here you can see Greensburg. And coming down 119 through Youngwood, you come upon New Stanton. And it appears as a hub of sorts. You see the roads coming in and connecting, the Turnpike and 66, 119, etc. As you come in on it, you can see some of the confusion which was not there in days gone by. New Stanton right here, once upon a time, used to be up here. This was one time New Stanton. It is now Old Stanton, and most people aren't even aware of it. And if you drop down just about a mile south of that, you come to this area right down here along the creek, Sewickley Creek, where there was very early an old mill, one of the original mill seats of the township. We'll see if we can't come in upon that a bit heavier. That's Sewickley Creek, come running down here. And that's New Stanton up here, and this is called Paintersville or Paintertown. You notice Mill Street is right here. Right in here along the creek once upon a time was an old mill. It was in the family of one of the very early preachers. In fact, he had the patent to this area in here. It was William Weaver or Weber. He was a German immigrant. And in German, his name would have been Wilhelm Weber, and it would be pronounced Weber. But the word Weber in German, or Weber, means weaver. So sometimes you see the name as Weaver. He was a preacher who founded many of the early churches in the area in late 1700s, early 1800s. One of his sons was a millwright and he built the original mill down here, which was a water mill. And then later on, after that mill fell into oblivion, Israel Painter built another mill right around here, which was a much more modern one. I mean, modern for 1850. It was built in the early 1850s, which was a steam mill. And towns would often congregate around a mill. And that was the beginning of the habitation down this way that eventually culminated in New Stanton being down here. Because one of the other things you see right here is the railroad. In the early 1870s, the Southwest Branch came through. And it was a stop here, Paintertown stop. And that was another big factor in the development of New Stanton being here rather than the area that's now Old Stanton. There are just a few more maps and a picture I want to take a look at here. This map dates from about 1912. And as you look at it, it is a bit confusing, but it points out a few things that it's worth knowing. By this time, which is around 1912, what used to be New Stanton is now Old Stanton. The transportation corridor that used to go through it now ends right here. It used to continue on over into here, which is now Youngwood, and the railroad coming down through here. New Stanton now has its location down here, which is just about where it is now. And you see right down south of New Stanton is Paintersville, named for Israel Painter, the fellow who put a mill in right here in the 1850s and had a plan of lots which developed into what's now part of New Stanton. And this which says it is New Stanton is no longer. This was New Stanton back in 1867 when this map was made. A fairly good-looking little town with no less than 3 blacksmiths. And you can see the other people in business. Horbaugh was a druggist and various merchants. Here's a guy who manufactured salt. There were a lot of salt wells locally. And there was a tannery in town where leather was made. And there were several guys in town who used that leather to make boots and shoes and saddles. And there was a guy named Sell, John Sell, was in town. He was probably the most prominent businessman in town. His store also had the post office. And as the fortunes of New Stanton became Old Stanton, in other words, the place started to die out, Sell moved on up to Greensburg, and his business place is still in evidence. if you've ever done anything or gone shopping over at Nature's Way, that was once Sell's establishment after he moved to Greensburg. This mapping is from the same time, 1867, showing New Stanton. Down here, what would become New Stanton is called Sewickley Mill. We'll focus in on that mill for a minute. This is the mill right here. Colonel Israel Painter's Mill, right beside the stream. The railroad is not there yet. And if you look around, you can see a lot of other things that Israel Painter was involved in. He was big in salt works. He got into all kind of stuff. He even at one time went to New Orleans and got involved in the cotton trade. And the next thing we'll see will be his mill. There's a photo of it. That was the mill built by Israel Painter at a good expense. And when you see a mill with a stack on like that, you know it had a steam engine in it. And down behind it ran the Sewickley Creek. And this view is looking more or less north from up on the bank of the, what was then, after about 1873, the railroad was up there, the Southwest Branch. And I think we've done enough now.